Chapter 4, We Agnostics. In the preceding chapters you've learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. That's a flat statement, isn't it? Are there any equivocation there? Any weasel words that you can see? Any out clauses? No. You will be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. Now, remember, we've talked about this before. Wherever you see Bill talking about spiritual experiences, he writes this book. That was translated at the time the 12th step was changed by the editorial board to spiritual awakening. But it means exactly the same thing. You're going to have a spiritual awakening as a result of working the steps. And here Bill says, the big book says, that only a spiritual experience, in other words, a spiritual awakening, will conquer this illness. To one who feels he's an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he's an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed, here's the dilemma, to be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. But it isn't so difficult, this business of having to choose. About half our original fellowship were exactly that type. At first some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. Perhaps it is going to be that way with you, but cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. Now this next paragraph is one of the more important paragraphs. The next three paragraphs, some of the most important stuff in this whole big book. Because this lays the groundwork and it establishes for us the basics. And I'm telling you that I learned a long time ago there's only one way to continue to work this program, and that is to continuously go back to the basics. Otherwise you get lost in all the falderall out there. All this stuff that comes floating around that really has nothing whatsoever to do with recovery, and it sounds pretty good. Bottom of page 44. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. A code of morals, a better philosophy of life are insufficient. If they had been sufficient, many of us would have recovered long ago. And this is true. There are lots and lots of people, maybe everybody in this room, wish to be moral, wish to have a better philosophy, wish to follow moral and ethical principles, but we found that we could not stay sober, even though we wanted to. But we found that such codes and philosophy did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral, we could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Here's the basic thing. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Isn't that a beautiful definition of powerlessness? You see, that's what we always have to come back to. Why am I here? I am here because I cannot stop drinking on my own. It doesn't make any difference how many times I'm told that I must not take another drink. It doesn't matter how many times I've been told not to drink and go to meetings and you'll be just fine. If you just don't drink, your whole life will change, and on and on and on, the same old sorry story. And nobody wants to tell us how you go about doing that. If I have no power to stop drinking on my own, how do I go about it? Well, let's see the next paragraph. Lack of power, of course, that's what we're talking about here. Lack of power. That was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live. Notice that's as opposed to die. A power by which we could live. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves. Please notice that the word power is capitalized. That means that we are talking about a deity here. We are not talking about an ashtray, doorknob, AA group, or pickup truck. We're talking about a deity. That's why the word power is capitalized. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves. By the way, has anyone in here ever seen anybody get down on their knees and pray to an AA group, or a doorknob, or an ashtray, or a pickup truck? I would be amazed if anybody said, yes, I've seen that happen. Or how about just praying to the group without getting down on our knees? You see, we can get down that blind alley, and before we know it, we're buried in something which is utterly unworkable. It has nothing whatsoever to do with recovery. We must find a power greater than ourselves, obviously, but where and how were we to find this power? That's the problem. Here's the solution. Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. Now that's just an absolutely flat statement, isn't it? That if we find a power greater than ourselves and surrender to that power, our problem will be solved. Let's take a look on page 85. By the time we get to the 10th step, let's see what's happened. It's all here. Page 85. Let's go to about 10 lines down from the top of page 85. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We have not even sworn off. That's because the big book never once says don't drink. It says find God. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. See that? And when this tells us back here on page 45 that we need to find a power which will solve our problem, and we do that by following the directions in this book. The basics of everything then comes back to this. We're powerless over alcohol. We're powerless over our thinking. We cannot direct our lives ourselves. We have to quit playing God. We've got to put a power greater than ourselves in our lives if we expect to recover. Period. 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 And if that power greater than ourselves is not there, we do not recover. And when we are still blocked off from God, we do not recover, and therefore we have to find out what it is that's blocking us and with God's help be freed from those things so that we can recover. Remember, by the time we get to the 10th step and the problem has been removed, what's happened? We've done our 4th step, we found out what the problems are, we found out what blocks us from God. In our 5th step, we've admitted all of that. In our 6th and 7th step, we've asked God to take away those things that block us from Him. In our 9th step, we have taken care of the guilt, remorse, and shame, which also blocks us from God, and we've done this with God's help and through His grace. And now when we reach our 10th step, we've entered the world of the Spirit, we've become God conscious, we've been restored to sanity, and the problem's been solved. See, these are all basic things, and this is what we have to concentrate on. If we get lost in the woods of all the psychobabble and the human solution stuff that floats around here, we may never get to a point where we, in fact, can recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. So it all goes back to powerlessness. I was talking to somebody today, and they were reciting to me some things which were happening in their life. And they were very angry and didn't know why. And I said to them, take a look at this. You feel powerless. And powerlessness always leads us back to fear, and fear leads us to anger, and anger to resentment. You can count on it. Let's go on now. Page 45, this second full paragraph. We got to find a power that will solve our problem. That means that we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, that we're going to talk about God. There's no weasel word there, no equivocation there. This big book talks about God. Why is it that we insist, some of us, that we must not do that we just might scare somebody off, or we might come off sounding as if we were sort of spiritually elite, or that kind of stuff. And so we talk all the way around it, and yet we're not willing to just flatly say, my sobriety is dependent entirely upon my surrender to the God of my understanding. Period. Because that's the truth. Here difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship, but his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God, for we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. We know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious, but you see, that's not the same as being agnostic or atheist. Being violently anti-religious can mean simply that I am totally turned off by all established religions. Many people believe that God is way too big to fit inside any one religion. And that men who have run these religious groups have established them and fashioned them in accordance with their own predilections and their own prejudices and their own interpretations, and have ruled their religions by fear. Now, you don't believe as we believe, you're going to hell and you're going to burn forever. Well, maybe that's true. And maybe it's not. I don't pretend to know. And I'm not sure that anybody really knows except through some kind of belief system which has no proof. But nevertheless, we're talking now about the person who's coming in here and needs to get sober in order for there to be any possibility of any kind of a life from here on out. And we're telling them it's going to be necessary for you to find a power greater than yourself, the power we call God. We don't care what you call this power. We don't try to tell you what your conception of this power ought to be. We tell you to choose your own conception. And we're not telling you that you have to believe as we believe. We're telling you that you have to be willing to believe that there just might be this power. That's all that is required to get started. We're going to read that 4 more times in this book as we get there in the next couple of pages. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of Him with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. We look upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We look askance at many individuals who claim to be godly. How could a supreme being have anything to do with it all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? Yet in other moments we found ourselves thinking, when enhanced by a starlit night, who then made all this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder. but it was fleeting and soon lost. Now this whole idea that we just read about dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was weak, even cowardly. Let's take a look at another thought along that lines over on page 68. Third full paragraph, page 68. We never apologize to anyone for depending upon our Creator. We can laugh at those who think spirituality the way of weakness. Paradoxically, it is the way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. That's the third step prayer, isn't it? God, take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help with Thy power, Thy love, and Thy way of life. And the tagline would be, working in and through me. Allow me to be an example of God's power working in my life. And we go on page 46. Yes, we of agnostic temperament have had these thoughts and experiences. Let us make haste to reassure you. We found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice and express even a willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves, we commenced to get results, even though it was impossible for any of us to fully define or comprehend that power, which is God. This is the first time where the Big Book has tied together the words power and God, separated by two words. That power, which is God. To our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect a contact with Him. As soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, the spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things, we began to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. Notice that we're going to begin to sense the flow of God's Spirit into us almost immediately. The culmination of that flow of spirit energy really does not occur until we get to the 10th step. But nevertheless, we begin to feel it almost immediately. Here's what Bill said. He said, I learned I had to pray just as if there were a God, and when the miracles started coming and I could no longer deny they came from a power greater than myself, that's when faith began. And faith was the greatest gift of all. And then it tells us here that as soon as we did these things, we were going to have this new sense of power and direction, provided, and this is the big catch, here's the catch, provided we took other simple steps. You see, the Big Book is not promising us that we're going to come in here, do nothing, and end up finding God and being imbued with God's power and having a spiritual awakening. Quite the contrary. It's telling us that we must take these steps. In other words, if you look at the 12th step, it tells you the truth. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. Not because we sat around and wished for it, not because we faithfully attended AA meetings, or filled up coffee cups, or swept the floor, because we worked the steps. We found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek Him. Boy, there's a tagline on that, isn't there? God isn't going to make too hard terms with us if we seek Him. To us, the realm of spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding to those who earnestly seek. It is open, we believe, to all men. And this, remember, takes us back, each time we read something like this, it takes us right back to Ebby and what Ebby told Bill. In fact, let's review that just for a second to make sure. Page 12, please. Let's go back to Bill's story Because we see the genesis of all of this stuff coming from Bill's experience with Evie that first few days of sobriety. Page 12, second full paragraph on page 12, about a third of the way down the page. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, "Why don't you choose your own conception of God?" That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. And then this next one, we're going to see this in just a second in chapter 4. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. This is where Bill is taking his second step, of course. And so now let's take a look at the top of page 47 again. When, therefore, we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to affect our first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth. But if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was. We needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say that he does believe or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone, a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. The last paragraph on page 47, that was great news to us, for we had assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith which seemed difficult to believe. When people present us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we all say, "I wish I had what that man has. I'm sure it would work if I could only believe as he believes. But I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him." So it was comforting to learn we could commence at a simpler level. We do not have to come into AA and begin our program and our path here with a full-blown set of spiritual beliefs. Quite the contrary. Many of us, maybe half of us, start at a place which is basically dead zero, or maybe in a negative place somewhere. There's a famous saying by Henry Ford, and he said that when I hear it, I'm interested. When I see it, I may believe it. But when I experience it, then I understand it. And so, if we take that in its literal sense, then the God of our understanding is what? It's a God we've experienced. And if somebody asks me, how do you understand God? All I can say in response to that is to tell them about God as I have experienced God working in my life. It was comforting to learn that we could commence on a simpler level. Besides the seeming inability to accept much on faith, we often found ourselves handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. Many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. This sort of thinking had to be abandoned. Though some of us resisted, we found no great difficulty in casting aside such feelings. And here's the reason. Faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we had tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as some of us were. And this business of being prejudiced or prejudging, of course it can cut in a lot of different ways, can't it? Because it may be prejudice which has come to us from our religious beliefs or religious teachings. The reader may still ask why he should believe in a power greater than himself. We think there are good reasons. Let's have a look at some of them. The practical individual today is a stickler for facts and results. Nevertheless, the 20th century readily accepts theories of all kinds, provided they are firmly grounded in fact. We have numerous theories, for example, about electricity. Everybody believes them without a murmur of doubt. Why this ready acceptance? Simply because it is impossible to explain what we see, feel, direct, and use without reasonable assumption as a starting point. Everybody nowadays believes in scores of assumptions for which there is good evidence, but no perfect visual proof. And does not science demonstrate that visual proof is the weakest proof? It is being constantly revealed as mankind studies the material world that outward appearances are not inward reality at all. To illustrate, well, now we've got even far more powerful illustrations of that thesis, don't we? How about quantum mechanics, quantum physics? This is a whole new field. It's not so new now, but I don't know that it's even being taught that much in school yet, but I guess it's been around for 25, 30 years. Quantum mechanics and quantum physics are teaching us some amazing, startling things about the physical world and the universe about us. For example, that when we observe the path of an electron passing through a magnetic field, and with powerful instruments they have today, they can do that. They found out that the effect of our observing that electron as it passed through the magnetic field would change its shape, its size, its mass, and its direction and its velocity. And this would all happen because it was being observed. And they thought, well, this cannot possibly be so. And yet it turns out to be true. That it is our observation of things physical which creates in some way their actual reality. And now the scientists are even saying the evidence is in. There must in fact be an infinite number of parallel universes. And there's doubt being cast upon the theory of relativity. And there's all kinds of stuff going on now in working with gravity and what gravity really is and how it can be artificially produced and maintained. And how we can establish anti-gravity and overcome the force of it. All these things are happening. And many of them run directly contrary to what we have always believed to be immutable laws of nature. Natural law. All this stuff about DNA is taking all the old rules of heredity and so forth, just tossed them out the window. The Mendelian laws are proving to be very unreliable as any kind of a guide as to what's actually going to happen with the individual. On and on and on and on. So Bill was, in 1935 and 1937, was giving us a peek into the future here, though he didn't know it. Because he says, in this business of outward appearances, to illustrate, the prosaic steel girder is a mass of electrons which are whirling around each other at incredible speed. These tiny bodies are governed by precise laws, and these laws hold true throughout the material world. Science tells us so. We have no reason to doubt it. When, however, the perfectly logical assumption is suggested that underneath the material world and life as we see it, there is an all-powerful, guiding, creative intelligence. Right there, our perverse streak comes to the surface, and we laboriously set out to convince ourselves it isn't so. We read wordy books and indulge in windy arguments, thinking we believe this universe needs no God to explain it. Were our contentions true, it would follow that life originated out of nothing, means nothing, and proceeds nowhere. That's pretty profound stuff, isn't it? Bill was some kind of a thinker. Life originated out of nothing, means nothing, and proceeds nowhere. Instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation, that's a great phrase, spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation. We agnostics and atheists chose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and end of all. Rather vain of us, wasn't it? I would say so. We who have traveled this dubious path beg you to lay aside prejudice, even against organized religion. We have learned that whatever the human frailties of various faiths may be, those faiths have given purpose and direction to millions. People of faith have a logical idea of what life is all about. Actually, we used to have no reasonable conception whatever. We used to amuse ourselves by cynically dissecting spiritual beliefs and practices when we might have observed that many spiritually minded persons of all races, colors, and creeds were demonstrating a degree of stability, happiness, and usefulness which we should have sought for ourselves. And that's certainly true. That's certainly true. An interesting sidelight to that, of course, is that in the churches and in the cathedrals and in the synagogues and in the temples, there's a huge effort being made by the ministers, priests, rabbis, and so forth to help us. We alcoholics and addicts. And yet, by and large, they're failing. By and large, it's not working for us. And this is not surprising because it's something which was obvious from the very beginning, that there was something missing that needed to be filled in. And I can't prove this, but I believe what is missing is the action of the 12 steps. That all the principles are there. Certainly if we read the book of James, for example, we're going to find all the principles. But where does it tell us what to do? That's the great failing of the 12 and 12. There's some wonderful philosophy in there, but not one word about how to work steps. Talks about them, doesn't show us how to work them, what to do. What's the action I have to take? To find that, we have to go to the big book. And when we do, we find it. It's right there. It tells us what to do. And when we do it, it works. And every time it works, we say, wow, that worked again. Here we go. These people are right. This book is right. Let's go top of page 59, or 50. Instead, we looked at the human defects of these people and sometimes used their shortcomings as a basis of wholesale condemnation. We talked of intolerance while we were intolerant ourselves. We missed the reality and the beauty of the forest because we were diverted by the ugliness of some of its trees. We never gave the spiritual side of life a fair hearing. In our personal stories, you will find a wide variation in the way each teller approaches and conceives of the power which is greater than himself. Whether we agree with a particular approach or conception seems to make little difference. Experience has taught us that these are matters about which, for our purpose, we need not be worried. They are questions for each individual to settle for himself. Listen to that now, because this goes to the heart of the matter. They are questions for each individual to settle for himself or herself. One proposition, however, these men and women are strikingly agreed. Every one of them has gained access to and believes in a power greater than himself. This power in each case accomplished the miraculous, the humanly impossible. As a celebrated American statesman put it, let's look at the record. Here are thousands of men and women, worldly indeed. They flatly declare that since they have come to believe in a power greater than themselves, to take a certain attitude toward that power, and to do certain simple things, there has been a revolutionary change in their way of living and thinking. Let's go back in that sentence, that last sentence. What does it mean by simple things? Remember in chapter 2, we spent some time considering this. Talks about that simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. We have but to pick up that simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet. We ask ourselves this, are not some of us just as biased and unreasonable about the realm of the spirit as were the ancients about the realm of the material? Even in the present century, American newspapers were afraid to print an account of the Wright brothers' first successful flight at Kitty Hawk. Had not all efforts at flight failed before? Did not Professor Langley's flying machine go to the bottom of the Potomac River? Was it not true that the best mathematical minds had proved man could never fly? Had not Icarus tried to fly to the sun, and the wax on his wings melted, and he fell into the sea and drowned? Of course. That's not in the book. Well, you guys know the story of Icarus. Here. Well, we do know that the phoenix flew out of the ashes, so that should bring us some hope. Had not people said God had reserved the privilege to the birds? Oh man. Only 30 years later, the conquest of the air was almost an old story, and airplane travel was in full swing. Most fields our generation has witnessed complete liberation of our thinking. Oh, come on now, Bill. I mean, complete liberation? I seriously doubt it. Show any longshoreman a Sunday supplement describing a proposal to explore the moon by means of a rocket, and he will say, I bet they do it, maybe not so long either. Oh, there's a great story I forgot to tell you. Buzz Aldrin, who was the second man on the moon, is a friend of mine. In fact, I sponsored him when he first came in. And not too long ago, Buzz was approached by some guy who claimed that the moon landings were all staged on some kind of a sound stage out in the desert somewhere. And Buzz has never been known for his temperance. He hauled up and slugged this guy and knocked him down. I love that guy. He's terrific. He gave me the flag he took up there. It was on the moon, so I got to have that flag. Okay. Let's see. I bet they do it. Maybe not so long either. Is not our age characterized by the ease with which we discard old ideas for new? By the complete readiness with which we throw away the theory or gadget which does not work for something new which does? We had to ask ourselves, I get serious here, because this paragraph is real serious. This really tells us where we came from. We had to ask ourselves why we shouldn't apply to our human problems the same readiness to change our point of view. Remember what the promise is, that our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change? Change our point of view. We were having trouble with personal relationships, amen to that. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. Was not a basic solution of these bedevilments more important than whether we should see newsreels of lunar flight? Of course it was. Of course it was. Now, when you look at that, what do you see in that paragraph that would be of enormous help to a newcomer? Aren't they going to be able to identify themselves specifically with most of those points? Of course they are. So this is the kind of thing, these gems are found all the way through the big book. And if you ever begin to wonder about your own alcoholism, pick this up and read this one paragraph. See if it doesn't just strike right to the heart of the matter. When we saw others solve their problems by a simple reliance upon the Spirit of the universe, we had to stop doubting the power of God. Our ideas did not work. The God idea did. You notice the word simple again, guys? See how the big book just constantly is in agreement with itself. It's the only book I've ever read that is internally consistent in every respect. Now, we had to stop doubting the power of God because our ideas did not work, but the God idea did. Going on now, we're going back into history now. The Wright brothers' almost childish faith that they could build a machine which would fly was the mainspring of their accomplishment. You know that the wing design that they used, that nobody had done it before, is basically the same wing that's being used today. They just came to them. They got the idea of creating a lift above the wing. And then it worked. Without that, nothing could have happened. What Bill's saying here, that nothing could have happened had they not had the childish faith that they could build a machine which would fly. Well, what about us? Isn't it about time that we began to develop that kind of childlike faith? That we, in fact, can build a life for ourselves which will fly? We've been fluttering around the ground and being chased by foxes, martins, and every kid with a broom for all of our lives. And now we get to fly. We agnostics and atheists were sticking to the idea that self-sufficiency would solve our problems. When others showed us that God's sufficiency worked for them, we began to feel like those who had insisted their rights would never fly. And here's what we found out. Logic is great stuff. We liked it. We still like it. It is not by chance that we were given the power to reason, to examine the evidence of our senses, and to draw conclusions. In another place, Bill says God gave us brains to use. He evidently expects us to use them. We agnostically inclined would not feel satisfied with a proposal that does not lend itself to reasonable approach and interpretation. Hence we are at pains to tell why we think our present faith is reasonable, why we think it more sane and logical to believe than not to believe, why we say our former thinking was soft and mushy when we threw up our hands in doubt and said, I don't know. Well, that's the mantra of the agnostic, isn't it? I don't know. I don't know. Wonderful place to hide out, but unfortunately it doesn't lead anywhere. Now this brings us to the pivot point in chapter 4. It brings us to this one little paragraph of 5 lines, which constitutes the second step. Page 53. 53. Listen to this now. There's so much in here. So powerful. When we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis. Wait a second. Self-imposed? Well, I thought this all came about because I was this sick guy, this alcoholic. And look at all those things that people have been doing to me all these years, And that guy down there at treatment center said that my whole problem was the fact that my family was dysfunctional. And here it's saying, wait a second, crushed by a self-imposed crisis we could not postpone or evade, which is a perfect definition, is it not, of a motto. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else He is nothing. God either is or He isn't. What was our choice to be? Now you say, well, how can that be the second step? It's easy, guys. Think about it. God either is or He is not. And if we answer, God is, God's either everything or He is nothing. And we answer, God is everything. Well then, if God is and God is everything, can we ever possibly doubt that He can restore us to sanity? See how easy that is? If God is and God is everything, there can be no doubt that He is powerful enough to restore us to sanity. Arrived at this point, we were squarely confronted with the question of faith. We couldn't duck the issue. Some of us had already walked far over the bridge of reason toward the desired shore of faith. The outlines and the promise of the new land had brought luster to tired eyes and fresh courage to flagging spirits. Friendly hands had stretched out in welcome. See the picture now? We are on the bridge of reason, and over here is the new land of faith. And there are people standing there in that new land. And our bridge of reason does not extend all the way to new land. We've come as far across the bridge of reason as we can. Friendly hands are stretched out in welcome, in fact saying, come on, we're here, come join us. We were grateful that reason had brought us so far, but somehow we couldn't quite step ashore. Perhaps we'd been leaning too heavily on reason that last mile, and we did not like to lose our support. So what we're going to find is that it was at this juncture that we took that first leap of faith. We took that leap of faith from the end of the bridge of reason to the new land. And the friendly hands and faces and bodies that were there caught us as we landed in the new land. And that's what we do here, you know. We have been around for a while. We get to do that every day. We get to say, come on, take that leap. We're here, we'll catch you. Come join us, be with us. And every once in a while, somebody does. And they too get to recover. And most of the time, they don't. We found too that we had been worshipers. What a state of mental goose flesh that used to bring on. Had we not variously worshipped people, sentiment, things, money, and ourselves? And as a matter of fact, one could almost insert the word especially ourselves. And then with a better motive, had we not worshipfully beheld the sunset, the sea, or a flower? Who of us has not loved something or somebody? How much do these feelings, these loves, these worships have to do with pure reason? Little or nothing, we saw last. Were not these things the tissue out of which our lives were constructed? Do not these feelings, after all, determine the course of our existence? It was impossible to say we had no capacity for faith or love or worship. In one form or another, we've been living by faith and little else. Now that's a really strong statement. But it's important when you're working with your sponsees, try to get them to see this. Ask them, for example, if you plant a seed, do you dig it up every day to see if it's sprouting roots? Well, why don't you? Well, you have faith that it's going to grow. You're going to wait till it pops above the ground. And then you'll say to yourself, why am I not surprised? When you flip a light switch, did you expect the light to come on? What do you know about electricity? What do you know about generating plants? What do you know about nuclear fission, which created the electricity? What do you know about light switches? Unless you're Ivan or somebody with his mechanical genius. Most of us don't know. We haven't got a clue. But when we flip the switch, we damn well expect the lights to come on, don't we? Did you ever look in the refrigerator to make sure that try to look in and make sure the light goes out? Why don't you? You have faith that light's going to go out, don't you? And so, when you stop to think about it, and you can help your sponsee this way. Most of the things that we do in life, we do by rote. We do by habit. We do by reflex. There's a very famous man, George Bernard Shaw, who made this comment. He said, most people think constructively once a week. I have made an international reputation for myself by thinking constructively 3 times a week. So you see, think about this now. You're driving down I-95. What a horrible thought. When in those 10-foot lanes, surrounded by semis doing 85, and 3 or 4 cowboys in their hopped-up cars dodging in and out. Suppose you had to think, now I turn left, now I turn right, now I put my foot in the brake. You wouldn't survive 30 seconds out there. You see, if we're not able to drive by reflex, our eyes see something, our ears hear something, it sends a message and we just do it. If I had to think, okay, better put your foot on the brake, okay, foot lift up, move from accelerator to brake pedal, push down on brake pedal, well, we'd have already crashed long before, wouldn't we? So much of what we do simply by reflex. We do simply by habit. And we get in the habit of expecting all sorts of things will automatically take place. And we take that on faith. Now go back on page 54 again. Imagine life without faith. Were nothing left but pure reason, it wouldn't be life. Well, we believed in life, of course we did. We could not prove life in the sense that you can prove a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points, yet there it was. And of course now, Bill wrote this in 1939, and there's severe doubt now as to whether the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. It may very well be a curved line. But nevertheless, in those days, that was something that was you see, Bill was proving his own point here. That was considered as an article of faith, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Now we know that's probably not true. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, yet there it was. Could we still say the whole thing was nothing but a mass of electrons created out of nothing? Meaning nothing, whirling on to a destiny of nothingness? Of course we couldn't. The electrons themselves seem more intelligent than that. At least so the chemist said. What about the physicist now who is making sure that we understand that if we observe an electron, according to quantum mechanics and quantum physics, we now change not only the mass, the direction and the acceleration of the electron simply through the process of viewing it. So that there's nothing out there which is set in stone anymore. Quantum physicists now have come to believe that there is an infinity of parallel universes, for example. Hence we saw that reason isn't everything, neither is reason as most of us use it entirely dependable, though it emanate from our best minds. What about people who proved that man could never fly? Now we're getting into some really important stuff here. Yet we had been seeing another kind of flight, a spiritual liberation from this world, people who rose above their problems. And when you're new, and you look around you in the rooms, you get to know the people. You see people for whom this has happened. A new kind of liberation. In other words, what the big book says is that we're reborn. We're rising above our problems because now we have God there with us in our lives. They said God made these things possible. We only smiled. We'd seen spiritual release, but like to tell ourselves it wasn't true. What is this release? This release is the same thing we pray for in the third step prayer, isn't it? Release me from what? The bondage of self. Right. And when you think about joyousness and happiness and freedom, remember that freedom is the greatest gift. That means freedom from self. Let's go on. Actually, we were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. Wow. It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things, but in some form or other it's there. For faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are facts as old as man himself. Now, I believe that to be true, and I think probably a lot of you believe that to be true. From our own experience, when we relate back to our odyssey through the steps and through spiritual growth, the growth of faith, we realize that this was always there. We were the ones who were not there for it. We were the ones who denied it and put it aside and obscured it, and through self-delusion were able to deny the existence of our innate knowledge that there was some power operating in our lives which wasn't us. So we finally saw that faith in some kind of God is a part of our makeup, just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. And if we look at human history, go all the way back as far as we can, every civilization, even back into the caves, there was some God in their lives, some higher power in their lives. Yeah. Always. It's always been there, because we just know that this exists. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there. Now what is this searching? It's the same thing Tommy read when he was reading chapter 5. That God can and will if we seek him. And so we're looking here again at the idea of a search. The search is a product or a function of working the steps. When we work the 12 steps, we are literally seeking God. And if we understand that, then it makes a lot of sense out of what we're doing with these steps. We're on the path seeking God, which will take us from a place of rebellion and defiance to a place of surrender and obedience. That's the path that we're on. He was as much a fact as we were. We found the great reality deep down within us. In the last analysis, only there he may be found, was so with us. Okay, so we're going to find the power within. We're going to find the God within. What's important to teach your sponsees is that he or she is spirit, and God is spirit. God is with them, and they are with God. If our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, enables you to think honestly, encourages you to search diligently within yourself, then if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. With this attitude, you cannot fail. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you, is sure to come. The consciousness of God. Back again to what we read on page 85, that we do become God conscious by the time we reach the 10th step. Many of you have heard me say, those of you who I've worked with that attitude you cannot fail. And that's the truth. But one of the critical things is to not only hang on to that attitude, but act upon it. Now let's go back to page 53. We're going to find out where the test is for the second step. And fortunately for us, the Big Book gave us this test, and it's very, very simple, very straightforward, and it always works. You can tell by using this test whether or not your sponsee has in fact worked the second step. In other words, has received the gift of belief. Keep in mind again that the second step is a belief. It is not some kind of theoretical thing. It's not some kind of theological thing or religious thing. It's a very simple thing. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now when you remember that, you will not be seeking with your sponsees to go further than that, because it is not necessary. What is necessary for the second step is the coming of a belief. Now we've already talked about this before, but let's make sure that we understand. The first, second, and third steps are gifts. We cannot force them on anybody. You can't make anybody believe, for example. The belief is either going to come or it's not. If you try to force your sponsees to express a belief, you're doing them a terrible disservice. What we do is we test to see if the belief has in fact been given, because it comes as a gift. The admissions of the first step, the belief of the second step, and the decision of the third step are all gifts. And when we think of them in any other way, we get all bollocksed up, because then we begin to think in terms of being able to force these things to happen. For example, the treatment centers that use 496 questions to prove that that our lives are unmanageable, that's exactly what they're doing. The fact that we decide our life is unmanageable is irrelevant, because until the gift is given, we have not been brought to that place where we're going to be willing to admit our alcoholism. In this book you will read the experience of a man who thought he was an atheist. His story is so interesting that some of it should be told now. His change of heart was dramatic, convincing, and moving. Our friend was a minister's son. He attended church school where he became rebellious at what he thought was an overdose of religious education. For years thereafter, he was dogged by trouble and frustration. Business failure, insanity, fatal illness, suicide. These calamities in his immediate family embittered and depressed him. Post-war disillusionment, even more serious alcoholism, impending mental and physical collapse brought him to the point of self-destruction. One night, when confined in a hospital, he was approached by an alcoholic who had known a spiritual experience. Our friend's gorge rose as he bitterly cried out, "If there is a God, He certainly hasn't done anything for me." But later, alone in his room, he asked himself this question: is it possible that all the religious people I have known are wrong? While pondering the answer, he felt as though he lived in hell. Then, like a thunderbolt, a great thought came. It crowded out all else. Who are you to say there is no God? This man recounts that he tumbled out of bed to his knees. In a few seconds he was overwhelmed by a conviction of the presence of God. It poured over and through him with the certainty and majesty of a great tide at flood. The barriers he'd built through the years were swept away. He stood in the presence of infinite power and love. He had stepped from bridge to shore. For the first time, he lived in conscious companionship with his Creator. By the way, this is Bill's story. Remember, he didn't tell it this way back in his story, but now in chapter 4, he's telling us exactly what happened. There are a few details which one could charitably call poetic license, but the basic idea is exactly what happened to Bill. One night, when confined in a hospital, he was approached by an alcoholic who had known a spiritual experience. That was Bill in Towns Hospital, and the one approaching him was his friend Abby. Our friend's gorge rose as he bitterly cried out, "If there is a God, he certainly hasn't done anything for me." But later, alone in his room, he asked himself this question: is it possible that all the religious people I've known are wrong? Now, this is a question we might profitably ask ourselves if we're having difficulty with this. While pondering the answer, he felt as though he lived in hell. Then, like a thunderbolt, a great thought came. It crowded out all else. Who are you to say there is no God? Ooh, sorry, sir. If we look at the Old Testament, by the way, we will find that way back there, somewhere in the Old Testament, it tells us that the only unforgivable sin is to deny the existence of God. And so here we see God coming into Bill's life. This was his epiphany. This was his bright light experience, his burning bush experience. Let's go on and see what he has to say about this. Thus was our friend's cornerstone fixed in place. No later vicissitude has shaken it. Bill often talked about the fact that no matter what happened to him, this spiritual experience, this awakening, this epiphany never left him. His alcoholic problem was taken away. That very night, years ago, it disappeared. Save for a few moments of temptation, the thought of drink has never returned, and at such times a great revulsion has risen up in him. Seemingly, he could not drink even if he would. God had restored his sanity. Now, at this point, if you were literal-minded and if you were searching for something to be critical of the big book about, you'd say, well, wait a minute. Does this have to happen to me or I'm not going to recover? Do I have to have an epiphany? Do I have to have the bright light, the burning bush, the great clean wind blowing from the mountaintop? Do I have to be restored all at once or I can't recover? And this is a position that was taken by some of the liberals in the fellowship at that time. They believed that this was a story which would totally confuse newcomers, and they insisted upon writing the Appendix 2, which is the sham. Because let's see what else it says here. Page 57 now. What is this but a miracle of healing? Yet its elements are simple. Listen to this now. Circumstances made him willing to believe. He humbly offered himself to his Maker. Then he knew. Even so has God restored us all to our right minds. Now here's the real rule. To this man the revelation was sudden. Some of us grow into it more slowly. But he has come to all who have honestly sought him. Now this business of seeking God is repeated over and over again. Remember, every time you hear chapter 5 being read, the third pertinent idea, God can and will if we seek him. This whole idea of seeking God is the backbone of the program of the 12 steps, because that's what they're here for. They're here to be able to enable us to seek God. When we do the work of the steps, we are seeking God. And when we do that, we inevitably will come to the realize that all of these promises have come true. He has come to all who have honestly sought Him. When we drew near to Him, He disclosed Himself to us. Notice again, please, that the first thing that has to happen is for us to draw near to Him. Remember back in the beginning of this chapter 4, we read that God is interested in us humans if we want Him enough. It is the wanting, it is the actions we take to fulfill that wanting that open up all the doors. Everything in this program of the 12 steps has to do with the actions we take. None of it has to do with sitting around wishing for it, waiting for it, arguing about it, listening to other people doing it. None of it has anything whatsoever to do with spilling our guts in an AA meeting. It has almost nothing to do with making coffee or emptying ashtrays. Those things are very wonderful for the fellowship. But it is the action we take in working the steps that leads to recovery and nothing else. We find God, we get from a place of rebellion and defiance to a place of surrender and obedience by working the steps, doing the work of the steps. Now here's the rule, and it's so simple. Everything in this program is just bloody simple. First, we do what we're supposed to do, and then God does what He promises. Then we do what we're supposed to, then God does what He promises. This goes on and on and on and on the rest of our lives. We do what we're supposed to do, God does what He promises. And we remember that, then it becomes easy. The concept is so simple. Do what you're supposed to do. God will inevitably do what He promises. And we keep doing what we're supposed to do. The big book says we're very, very undisciplined people. We have to let God discipline us. The whole trick of staying sober and growing spiritually boils down to being disciplined and consistent and doing the work. Because all the other stuff that's around us is peripheral to this and has absolutely nothing to do in the final analysis with recovery. That if we don't work the steps with a good heart, if we don't actively seek God with a good heart, if we don't do the work and continue to do the work, we don't recover regardless of whatever else we may do. It's that simple. But you know, the wonderful thing is, if we follow directions, if we are disciplined and consistent, we have a life beyond anything we could ever have imagined for ourselves. We get to have our heritage. What is our heritage? That we be happy, joyous, and free. For the first time in our lives, we get to experience happiness, joyousness, and freedom. And freedom is the greatest of those gifts, because freedom means freedom from the bondage of self. Great miracles, my friends, great miracles, great gifts, great gifts, grace and gifts. And we get to have them, but we have to work for them. We can't have them otherwise. They don't come otherwise.